Hello and welcome to Smaulgld.com. The curious case of the gold-backed yuan story just got curiouser. The idea of a Chinese yuan oil contract convertible into gold actually predates a September 1 Nikkei Asian Review story. Gold Money published an article on August 24th predicting that such a contract would be convertible into gold sourced from the Shanghai Gold Exchange. Now, this story shifted in mid-September to gold would be sourced from outside of China to satisfy the oil for gold transaction once it was recognized that gold cannot be exported from the Shanghai Gold Exchange. Now, so far, the Chinese government has not announced any gold-backed or gold-convertible oil contract. But we've been living with this story for about 6 to 8 weeks, and it changes. And as far as I can conclude, not only has no contract, gold backing, gold convertibility been announced, but the way it's described now is it's two contracts and China's got nothing to do with it. If an oil producer wants to buy gold with the proceeds from the oil that they sell to China, that's their business. Well, that's always been their business. There's no game changer there. The story may be about a yuan-denominated oil futures contract, but that's not the same thing as a gold-backed or gold-convertible oils contract. But I found out some more information that I want to share with you and give you some background, and you might find this quite interesting, or how the gold-backed yuan story fell apart. So this story first came out September 1st, as we mentioned, and we covered it, with some suspicion in China's planning gold-backed yuan as payment for oil. We discussed the story. We talked about why it might make sense, why it might make sense. But all along, we had cast a suspicious eye towards the story because, first, it just said China sees New World Order with oil benchmark backed by gold. It didn't cite a source. It just said China is expected shortly to launch a crude oil futures contract priced in yuan and convertible into gold, and what analysts say could be a game changer for the industry. First thing we noted was no source, no official source, not even an unnamed source. It just said China is expected. And we asked by whom? Who expects this? Then I looked through the story and I see who's cited in it. You notice some very familiar names, all of them gold-based people, people that like gold, people that promote gold, maybe even sell gold. I thought that was strange that the story would choose to speak to those people. Okay, I'm going to put that little bit aside. Then last week, we wrote a story, the gold-backed yuan story forks again as more cracks appear in the story. And in that article, we were noting these different ideas about where the gold may be coming from, and the story had decidedly shifted away from gold coming from the Shanghai Gold Exchange or gold coming from anywhere in China, but to outside China. And as I mentioned, if China's not supplying the gold, it's got nothing to do with China. It's not gold-backed. It's not gold convertible at all. Any more than when someone spends dollars that they get from the United States. For example, when the U.S. buys gold, the oil producer gets dollars. The United States buys oil, and the oil producer gets dollars, and they go and buy gold. That doesn't make the dollar gold-backed. Okay, so we covered that, and that seems to be where the story lies right now, that the Shanghai Gold Exchange got nothing to do with it. China's not going to back it. Well, then there is no gold-backed gold yuan story. However, over the past month, we saw many commentators, including Jim Rickards, say that the gold would come from the Shanghai Gold Exchange. On September 27th, Jim Rickards wrote in Agora Financial's The Daily Reckoning, China just announced, and again, we have seen no announcement, that any oil exporter that accepts yuan for oil can convert the oil to gold on the Shanghai Gold Exchange and hedge the hard currency value of gold on the Shanghai Futures Exchange. So wrote Jim Rickards that China announced such an arrangement in Agora Financial's Daily Reckoning on September 27th. Of course, we found that very curious. We haven't seen a Chinese announcement, but Mr. Rickards said China announced. Now, earlier this week, we wrote in Here Comes the Gold-Backed Yuan Without the Yuan, we had noted that we still hadn't seen any announcement, and there was no source that this story was true and that China was going to back the yuan with gold. But we started to see these stories on King World News and Hugo Salinas Pricing and Alistair McLeod, we'll talk about in a second, that the gold would be sourced outside of China, which of course no longer means it's a gold-backed yuan, but rather just a choice that an oil producer might make to take the yuan proceeds from the sale of oil to China and buy gold. Now, their argument is that's going to create gold demand, and I don't know how that does, because anytime someone receives dollar, that's a potential gold purchaser. So I get paid from my employer. Well, now I can go and buy gold. Well, that's true with any dollar transaction. That's true with any yuan transaction. The more that people receive currency, the more, theoretically, they can convert it into gold. That doesn't make the contract or the source of the funds gold-backed. Okay, so now here's the curious part. A few days ago, Rory Horrell, the Daily Coin, interviewed Alistair McLeod of Gold Money, and he was cited in this Asian Nikkei review story on September 1st. And during the interview, Alistair attempted to clarify the status of the oil for gold arrangement. Here's what he said, and he says this at 9 minutes and 13 seconds into the video that I've linked below, but I'll read it to you. This is another point I need to make absolutely clear. I saw an article the other day written by someone, was that Jim Rickards? I don't know, who sort of picked up on this idea and thought that China would be supplying the gold. No! This is a means of sourcing gold out of international markets. China is not going to supply any gold whatsoever. China has ring-fenced all of her gold and all of her citizens' gold by having capital controls. They can't get 1 ounce out of China. China, I can tell you, has no intention of supplying any gold in payment for oil. The gold has to come from existing markets. So that's what the story is now. But again, that's not a gold-backed yuan at all. And that's, I believe, an accurate state of play. But that follows that the contract is not gold-backed or convertible into gold, but rather a situation that oil producers might find it attractive to buy gold with their proceeds. But here's the curious part. Where might someone have got the idea that the gold to support this yuan oil future contract might come from China? Because remember, Mr. McLeod said someone sort of picked up on this idea and thought China would be supplying the gold. No, says Mr. McLeod. Now, why would they even think that? Well, Alistair McLeod, writing for Gold Money on August 24th in Gold Crossing the Rubicon. Remember, this is before the publication of the Asian Nikkei review story. He says, already China is showing a preference to settling trade and energy deals in yuan. But to take this much further, it will need to offer gold convertibility to compete with the dollar. This appears to be pursued in 2 steps, the first being oil suppliers given the opportunity to sell their oil for yuan and to sell their yuan on the Shanghai Futures Exchange for gold. Curious. Where might somebody have got the idea that this contract might be settled on the Shanghai Gold Exchange? He goes on to say, the yuan gold contract already exists. The oil yuan contract will shortly be introduced. The Shanghai International Energy Exchange is currently training potential users on carrying out system tests prior to launch later this year. Obviously, these futures contracts in gold and oil may need to be initially supported by Chinese state banks to enable them to build liquidity. So clearly, on August 24th, Mr. McLeod is saying that the gold would be settled on the Shanghai Futures Exchange. And then, as we say, a week or so later, Nikkei Asian Review story comes out, gold back yuan, game changer, and so on. Now, on September 13th, gold researcher Coase Jansen and Rory Hall are having a conversation back and forth by email, which part of which has been published, and there's a link here. And Rory was interested as to how this story came about. He was scratching his head, said it didn't make sense. Wanted to know what the source was. I had conversation with Rory on the same topic. And Coase, who is a Chinese gold researcher, very knowledgeable, and part of the conversation I'll read here, which again is at this link. This is him saying to Rory, in addition on Twitter, I've read people that think all the gold in China can be used to, quote, back the contract. but they seem to be ignorant of the mechanics of the Shanghai Gold Exchange, the Chinese domestic market, and the Shanghai International Gold Exchange, which of course Mr. Jansen is very familiar with. And he says all the gold in the Chinese domestic market is prohibited from being exported, just as Alistair said just the other day. Well, on September 14th, writing for Gold Money again, Alistair McLeod writes in Outlook for the Dollar and the Price of Gold, China is on the verge of offering oil producers the facility in the Shanghai futures market to swap oil for yuan and yuan for gold, and then he says sourced from outside of China. So it seems as if he had been reminded that the gold couldn't be sourced on the Shanghai Gold Exchange. Now, if the gold is not sourced on the Shanghai Gold Exchange or in any way backed by gold in China or backed by the People's Bank of China, or somehow China is involved in delivering or facilitating the delivery of gold, then it's not a gold-backed or gold-convertible yuan. End of story. You cannot have a gold-backed or yuan convertible into gold contract unless China actually is involved in either supplying the gold or facilitating the transaction, in which they are not. And that is what Alistair is saying on the 14th, that the gold, and that's what he's saying now. So the point is that the arrangement that Mr. McLeod is speaking of, and what seems to be what others are now saying, the story now is that the gold will not come from China. Well, if the gold doesn't come from China and China doesn't arrange for the gold delivery, then it is not a Chinese-backed or Chinese convertible story. Now, you can say whoever said it was, I just showed you who said it was. So the point is, the latest version of the unannounced gold-backed story, if it rests here, there is no gold-backed yuan story at all. Thank you.